Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone for attending this meeting about Salvadoran migrants under temporary protected status. We're very pleased to have you here and to have our guests to have a lively conversation about a very important topic that it's part, to some extent, of the current political debate in the White House and Congress. And we're pleased to have three colleagues coming from different backgrounds, regions, experiences, to share some of these views about this very important issue. Andrew Selee from Migration Policy Institute, Oscar Chacon from Alianza Americas.
Alianza Americas.
Alianza Americas. Okay. Y Eugenia Brizuela, former Foreign Minister of El Salvador. You all are familiar with the latest news about the ending of the temporary protected status for several communities, Haitians, Hondurans, and the last extension for El Salvadorans expiring on September 2019. There are important consequences relating to the decision from Homeland Security about the status. The reasons to it are perhaps debatable. However, the significance of the subject is the consequences for the United States, for a country like El Salvador, as well as for this basically Salvadoran American community. So we're here to talk about it just within the context of a current debate in immigration in the Senate. So I have a few questions to each one of you that we can use to open up the debate to hear your input too. And to Andrew, my question is, where does, in the current policy environment and the political debate, where is TPS fitting into this discussion? Is there any visibility going on in the House, the Senate, or the White House about it? Is there any discussion of a relief of enforcement, actually, or any other solution, if you may call it? Oscar, last night we had a dinner with several members of Congress, and one of the representatives used the term that we are living on a toxic environment. And definitely migrants in general, not only those under TPS, but the wider category of immigrants in the United States have been made part of this so-called toxic debate. So my question is, well, what can we say about this population, particularly those under TPS? One question that is being raised in the streets, in the media, or in the political speak is, what part of temporary did they not understand? And the question that comes to mind to me is, well, who's they? Is it the immigrants or the US government that has the authority to exercise the extensions? And Maria Eugenia, you're coming from El Salvador. This is, in the 1980s, they used to compare the size of El Salvador with one of the smallest states in the United States. They used to use Massachusetts sometimes as an example. And it's a country that has lots of problems. Notwithstanding the effort of doing something better for the country, it has challenges. You know, they still have over 20,000 young gang operations. We have homicide rates over 12 people every day, and still an unfortunate poor economic performance of less than 1% growth. So my question is basically, how do you see a possible, if at all, return of this population within the current context of El Salvadoran society? And how do you see Salvadorans, who, to a large extent, they have become Salvadoran Americans? The average length of stays of Salvadorans in the United States on TPS is 21 years. So I was talking to Andrew, it's like if you were leasing an apartment or a house, and after 20 years the landlord tells you, it's time to go. You just have, we run out of town. What is the recourse that you will have to consider going somewhere else? And in this case, going to a country that is no longer what it used to be. Salvadorans have ties to El Salvador, but they have roots in the United States. So how do you address this issue within that other side of the river? So with that, I open the questions, and please.
Great, thank you. Well, Manuel, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for organizing this. And on behalf of Migration Policy Institute, we're very proud to be part of this discussion. Thank you to Lisa and our team for working on this. I'm reminded, actually, I wasn't going to say this, but I'm reminded of a conversation with your apartment example. I was speaking to someone who heads the civil service side of the immigration office in a country that will remain unnamed in Europe, that has turned incredibly enforcement oriented on migration. It is one of the countries, you can guess a couple here, it's not in Eastern Europe though, a country that is very much enforcement based, is known for its hardline policies on immigration. And we were sitting after a couple glasses of wine, this is in December, and he asked me about TPS, and I explained what had happened, the decision was, and he says, but what's the statute of limitations? How many years you have to have lived in the United States to be eligible to apply for status? And I said, we don't really do that. We do, it's 1971, I believe, is the year. 72, it is actually in status, but 71 or 72 means you have to have been there for 50 years, right? So we basically don't do it, which he was stunned by this. And this is someone who's very hardline himself, personally agrees with the policies of his country, he's a civil servant, but he was stunned by this, actually. And I put that out there because this is a reflection, it tells us something about the immigration system we've created as well, right? I mean, there is something deeper, we'll talk specifically about TPS, but there is something deeper that's problematic here, that no matter how American you can become, no matter how many children and grandchildren you have, no matter how long you are part of the labor market, no matter what roots you lay down, there may simply be no transition for you. And that does say something deeper about what we need to fix. And reasonable people who disagree on the balance of enforcement versus facilitation can agree that there's something wrong there, right? This has been part of the point of agreement that has been reached time and time again by Republicans and Democrats, never completely successfully, but people kind of get that that's intuitively wrong, right? There's something wrong there. That said, let me start off with the White House, and before we talk about the way forward, which is the White House has a particular way of looking at this. One is political, which is that they are appealing to a base that was very supportive of President Trump, that got him the Republican nomination, that got him turned out in unusually large numbers to help him get elected as President of the United States. It's a minority of the country that feels very strongly about immigration and that immigration is a problem. When you look at polling on immigration, most Americans are actually very positive on immigration. It is actually quite, I sat down yesterday morning, a couple of you heard this, I sat down yesterday morning, heard it by chance, and started looking through polls, and I was actually surprised, even focusing on this from time to time, how consistent it is that Americans are positive on immigration. But there is a significant minority of this country that is not sanguine on immigration, that feels it is a major problem, and they're an important part of the political base of our president. And so part of the decision on TPS is part of a string of decisions that appeal to that base, right? And it's a political decision, as all presidents do. But there is a part of it that's also a philosophy, and we should, whether we agree with it or not, we should understand it, which is this sense that the executive has not enforced immigration laws and has used undue discretion to do things that they shouldn't do. So that's DACA, right? You go out and do DACA from the executive branch. Trump says, it'd be okay if Congress did it, but the executive branch shouldn't do this. TPS, keep extending TPS for an earthquake that happened a long time ago. I'm not going to go with that, right? That is that, right? Enforce our immigration laws, right? if you want to change, if Congress wants to change the laws, fine, but I'm going to enforce the laws as they stand. It's a particular stand. It is philosophically logical. That said, there is sometimes in public policy making a conflict between philosophy and public policy, what creates good public policy outcomes. And here I think they've ended up in a bit of a trap, which is eliminating TPS essentially puts a population into the illegal economy, into the informal economy, right? People who are almost entirely in the formal economy, who are incredibly productive, who have very high labor participation rates, they're not going back, unless they're caught, they're not going back to El Salvador or Honduras or Haiti. We'll see what happens on Honduras. So they're going to stay in this country for the most part. They're not a priority for deportation. And I think we should assume that DHS is not going to make TPS whole. I mean, we could be wrong and we don't know the answer to this, but it'd be really unusual for them to decide the TPS population is priority for deportation. So it does not actually fulfill the mission in terms of public policy, in terms of the ultimate outcome that they'd like to see, which is that, you know, people are going back, that you're going at starting with the highest priority people and moving on. It doesn't fit that either. So it makes logical sense from the philosophical starting point where they began. It does not make logical sense, however, even from the priorities of this White House in terms of public policy. Now, that said, you know, TPS does not have a huge constituency in the broader American public. It obviously has a constituency of people who have TPS. But in the way that DACA does, and DACA has become a front and center issue, there is not a large constituency in the U.S. Congress. There are a few members. You've met with some of them. There are a few members who care deeply about this. There certainly are cities where TPS matters more than others, where local politicians care about this. But it does not have, and where the news has followed this, journalists have followed this, but it doesn't have the same sort of public presence. And so going forward, to answer your question, Manuel, I mean, I think it's unlikely we're going to see a standalone TPS fix. There isn't a big enough constituency in a Congress that isn't able even to get DACA done to push TPS through. There is a chance, and it's a narrow window, but there is a chance that in a larger DACA negotiation, TPS could be added in. We saw this in the Lindsey Graham, Dick Durbin bill, what they were going to put forward as a compromise, which got shot down, which led to some very well-reported comments out of the White House. They did actually put TPS in there, so there are some legs, there are some people looking at this. There is a chance that if immigration policy, because the president put a lot of things on the table in addition to DACA, right? He made the DACA group bigger, but he also talked about legal immigration and border security and other changes in enforcement. There's a chance, you know, if Congress were able to do a bigger bill, there's a chance that TPS could slip in there. But as we watch the Senate negotiate, my fear is the Congress can't really do big things on immigration right now. If we get anything on DACA, it's likely to be either a temporary fix or it's likely to be a very simple DACA fix that doesn't add other things. But there's a chance. And there's one other thing I'll add, which is, you know, there is a lot of people, because they've been here so long. So I'm worried. I mean, I think TPS and it's likely to sort of hang out there. It won't become an enforcement priority, but it also won't become a priority to fix it. People are going to be left in limbo on this. There is one area that would be great if Congress could fix it, even if they don't fix TPS, and that is the way the TPS statute is written says that people cannot adjust to other statuses, right? They cannot adjust to other legal statuses. There are some exceptions to this. People who've left the country, who've gotten permission to leave the country, gone back to El Salvador, come back, can actually get around that. There are a couple loopholes, but there's a large number of people who could actually get applied for by their employers. They could get employment-based visas. They could get family-based visas from their children. And right now, under the current statute, they can't do that. We right now have two circuit courts that have ruled that, in fact, that's incorrect and that people should be able to adjust status. We could see the courts take care of this. We don't know where this will end up. That would actually, we don't know the number of people who would be helped by that, but my guess is these are people with deep roots in American communities. They're likely to have ways, and with American-born children in many cases, they're likely to have other avenues to legal status if we could get through that. And obviously with Congress, one thing that would be great, even if they don't deal with TPS, if they could correct that little piece in there, if there was a DACA negotiation, that would make a difference for a lot of people.
Thank you.
All right. You want me to talk about toxicity and what part of temporary don't they get?
It's the same thing.
Yeah. Let me just pick up on where Andrew left. What it is not possible is for you as a TPS recipient, by virtue of being in that condition, to evolve into something else. That you cannot do. But if I am a TPS recipient and I marry a U.S. citizen, and that U.S. citizen files a petition for me, I can certainly benefit, from that petition. I may have to ask for a pardon if I enter the U.S. without inspection, but if I enter the U.S. with a tourist visa, for example, it's rather easy for me to be able to do that. What recently the courts change in at least a couple of jurisdictions in the US is the possibility for my having been given TPS to be recognized as an admission into the country, officially speaking. Therefore, enabling me to actually benefit from a visa petition, even though I may have originally entered without inspection, that is illegally, I may still be able to adjust my immigration status, but that is only true in two jurisdictions, the 9th and the 6th Circuit states. Other than that, it is not officially recognized. Just to clarify that point. But by virtue of being in TPS alone, I cannot become tomorrow a legal permanent resident. And a lot of people, including members of Congress, have asked me, why haven't TPS just become legal? You know, if they've been here for so long under TPS, why haven't they applied for legal permanent residency? Because many times, even members of Congress do not understand the nuances of our own immigration policy system, which is indeed very obsolete. I mean, we actually put in place the architecture that we now have in place in 1965. That is the last time we actually thoroughly changed the very structure of our immigration policy. Now, on the toxicity question, one of the things that I always find myself explaining to people is that we love to suggest that we are a nation of immigrants. Actually, if you poll Americans, they by and large agree that we are a nation of immigrants. But this very nation of immigrants has never really been nice to newcomers. And you can go back all the way to colonial times, I mean, to realize that there is a bit of American exceptional remaking of history to try to erase the fact that we were never really nice with people who are newly arrived. Even if you happen to be white, to be blunt, you know, you're not necessarily welcome. And again, go back, you know, to our own history and discover, for example, that Benjamin Franklin didn't really like Germans, you know, for multiple reasons, even though they were skin level-wise white, okay? But what is different in the last 40 years is that the face of who are the immigrants began to change dramatically. You know, most Americans do not realize that back in 1970, according to our own US Census Bureau, only 8% of the foreign-born population were actually Mexican immigrants. 8%, 1970. Now, fast forward 40 years, and the face is very different. Immigrants in the US have indeed become primarily people of color, beginning with Mexicans. You know, and we were having a conversation before the program began that I was saying to some of my Salvadorian friends in the audience from El Salvador, that if I am walking down the street in the US and people see me and hear my very strong English accent, they will understand that I am probably Mexican. You know, and even if I say that I am from El Salvador, 5 minutes later they will ask me, where is that in Mexico? So that's just to give you an idea how the Mexicanness is way out there. And the fact that we have such a toxicity dominating the debate is not an accident. There are people in this country who 40 years ago realized that we needed to change the perception that people have about that particular group of foreign nationals. And they have done a good job. You know, many Americans are indeed negatively predisposed to this particular group of foreign nationals. So, indeed, TPS recipients are enduring what, in my opinion, have been two essential criteria that are now being directed from the very White House. And that those two sets of ideas are, one, we have too many foreigners, period. So we should have a moratorium on all immigration to this country. because we have too many foreign nationals in this country. And the second thing is, we have too many undesirables already here. So we have to kick them out. These two basic ideas were 40 years ago considered extremist ideas in the fringes of the US political debate. And nowadays, they are not. They are being dictated, as I said, from the very White House. So there is an extremist perspective residing in the White House and dictating policy. I think that that's the policy area, or the political area that Andrew was also referring to. There are people who believe that that is the way we should go about it. Now, I would argue that the temporariness question, I would say that more important than who did not get the memo about the meaning of the word temporary should not necessarily go to the people who received TPS. It should actually go to Congress, because anything at all that is 5 years or older, let's face it, is not temporary. You know, and frankly, I would argue that TPS is a very useful program, but it is a patch nonetheless. Because with TPS, what we did back in 1990 is create something middle of the road type of thing to face two realities. One, we don't have anything that allows people who come here for other reasons than persecution to actually be able to find a support environment in the US. And second, we did not believe that people like Central Americans back in the 1980s deserve political asylum, even though that was settled out of court in lawsuits, and it was actually settled on behalf of the plaintiffs. But the essential point is TPS does allow for immediate protection. And to that extent, I, for example, would argue that we should keep TPS in place, precisely to be used in circumstances like those that led to people now, as TPS recipients, were able to get it. Where is the real problem? The real problem is that, as Andrew pointed, and I want to reinforce that point, we don't have in our immigration policy a mechanism to actually acknowledge the fact that when somebody has been here for far longer than any one of us here would agree is temporary, we should have a mechanism to actually officialize the fact that these populations have become part of our permanency, part of our ongoing reality. And in this respect, I would only end saying most TPS recipients, in this case from El Salvador, 195,000 or so, they are not at all planning to go back to El Salvador. They will try to stay here any way they can. And at least many of us in the advocacy community, we believe that there are legal mechanisms for them to be able to stay, even if the Congress doesn't do anything in terms of fixing, that clear lack of equity, to say the least. Forget about justice, but equity. And we come to September of 2019 without a fix, legislatively speaking, for TPS recipients. I, for one, believe there are multiple avenues that are yet to be exhausted so that people can remain in this country without losing, immigration status altogether. But I have to tell you, for those who may not qualify for any of that, they would prefer to take their chances, staying in the US, raising the families they built, continuing to pay the mortgages that they may have acquired, as opposed to going back. Because going back, the question essentially is going back to what? So.
Thank you.
So let me also pick up on exactly what you're saying in the sense of they will not go back. But let's put it in context for El Salvador. Thank you so much for the invite, Manuel and Michael, who's also back there. And being in the company of such distinguished friends on the panel. We come here as part of a delegation from El Salvador. They are the people who are seated here on the first row. We're not government. We are private sector, we are from the banking system, we are from the most prestigious think tank in El Salvador, named recently by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank in Central America, which is FUSADES. And also the media that has accompanied us. Why? Because for us, Salvadorans on TPS are a national priority. And that's what we want to do. We want to complement the efforts that are being done, not only by El Salvador's government, but also by many NGOs, institutions who are here in the States, by community leaders where Salvadorans or other TPS holders make a difference in their communities because they have, as you have stated, integrated thoroughly into American society. What would it mean for us back in El Salvador to receive 195,000 TPS holders? I would be delighted, in a sense. It is the brain gain. These are people, if you compare them to the traditional deportees that we are getting back home. At this, we have a rate of approximately 56,000 deportees every year, and El Salvador has accepted to receive even more. Of these, maybe 8% are gang members, but we're getting ready to receive even more gang members. That will be another topic if we go into it. But referring to TPS, the people we receive right now, only 10% of them speak English. TPS holders, the immense majority, not only speak it, they speak it well. And many of them have seen, they grew up here, they're completely and thoroughly American and don't really understand and consider El Salvador their home. Some say, well, it's a brain gain, yes. For example, 24% of the population in TPS work in construction. But tell me, is construction the same here as we do back home? Are the construction licenses and abilities, are they really transferable? I think some things are, but not all. And what I personally, and with the delegation that is here, representing all of these economic sectors that we need definitely this brain gain, but we recognize the human tragedy of breaking families and also of understanding, for them, the peril that we would put them in. El Salvador, unfortunately, is going through terrible circumstances of violence. And gangs are gaining control of territories where they impose what they call rent, which is extortion. Wouldn't this TPS, returnee that goes with money, I will make that point in a second, or with children who, most of them speak Spanish with a bit of the English accent, they become extorted, but also victims of extortion, but also victims of recruitment. Why? Because gangs that were born here in the States, they prefer to have links back to the States. And all these kids have links in the United States. So we don't want to put all of those. It's 192,500 U.S. citizens who are children born to TPS holders. So they would get a path also. As soon as they become adults, if the law remains the same, they will be able to claim that their parents also are legal migrants here. So a massive deportation would definitely also be contrary to general U.S. foreign policy. We have had a fruitful and very close relation with the United States, and we are extremely grateful for that. El Salvador nowadays is an example of a nascent democracy where former guerrilla fighters left their guns, took up as a political party, and through elections won a position in government. So we need the time to consolidate this nascent democracy, to build upon it, and to continue to make El Salvador vibrant. But at this moment, with economic growth at less than 1% a year, with violence scaling and having state warnings of traveling to El Salvador because it is considered one of the most violent countries in the world, those are the situations in which we see it would not really benefit. But let's make the case that some TPS holders make it down to the country. Better prepared, maybe with a bit of money and savings. I said I wanted to touch upon that. The president of the banking system is here, and he can also testify that remittances last year went up 12%. But they were not consumed. Much of that increase went into savings deposits. That means people are afraid, and they're starting to make just a little savings back home if they have to go back. What we see then is a displacement of labor, because in El Salvador, we have an unemployment figure of almost 500,000. Youth entering to the labor force is around 50,000. And I am ashamed to say that last year, we were only able to generate formal jobs 3,000, because the framework to make positive investment within the country, the framework that guarantees then and gives that security for that economic growth, we're still fighting and striving to put it on in the context of this new democracy and of institutionalizing also the rule of law. We're very proud of the advances that we have had through our Attorney General with the support of the U.S., in which we are now, pursuing corruption, pursuing everything that has to do also with impunity. And so, to close my statements and open up the floor, because we really do want to answer your questions. Right now, we feel that this week was vital for us to come here, to bring this unanimous voice from the people of El Salvador, to accompany Congress, where we do hope, Andrew, that TPS, and not only for Salvadorans, but for the 13 nations that have 325,000 TPS holders, find a way forward. Immediately, also, we need legal counsel. We need the government, El Salvador government has already installed some legal counsel in the different consulates, but it's not enough. We have to open and support the doors of so many more that can help our people find the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a difficult puzzle to solve. It seems like it's a counterintuitive approach as it is right now, short of addressing some solution in the form of a legal permanent residency status. Let me open the floor for questions from you. Please say your name and your affiliation. Thank you. We'll do 3-4 questions in one. We have one here. 2.
Thank you. My name is my name is Abel Núñez. I'm the executive director of the Central American Research Center, also on the board of Alianza Americas. Thank you for having this space. I have 2 questions if the panelists can sort of speak to it. So, as we're thinking about TPS at this particular point, it's a data point in terms of our immigration history, right? I mean, whether they get it or not. But I would like to put this into a larger context, given that in this country we have very short memory, and we fail to understand the political and societal context in which we live. So to Andrew, I would ask as sort of a data person, put this into context in terms of the changing demographics of this nation, and what does it mean for a country that overall is changing in its makeup, and who the dominant culture may be in the next 50 years. Not politically, just in terms of numbers. And what does that mean? How does that fall into what we're living at this moment, right? The fear of a dominant culture losing controls of the stewardship of the nation. And you can add to that. And then the second question is more of a political one. Again, we speak about immigration and whether it's DACA or TPS or the undocumented community, as if people have left or either came to this country for the wonderful benefits that they are to live the American dream, without understanding what are the connection points of the U.S. political foreign policy in those regions that has contributed to the conditions in the nations that then push people here. And then the U.S. here does not take any responsibility. So speak to the fact that where was MS-13 created? Why was there a huge influx of Salvadorans in the 80s? And it is not a historical trend. Why are we the third largest population of Latinos in the U.S.? Because those have a past, they have a present, and they're going to have a future. And I think if we just look at it without that context, it limits us to saying, because what I hear from the right is like, well, why is it our responsibility for the violence in that nation? Why is it our responsibility for the poverty in that nation? They need to fix it on their own. It seems that we are forced as Americans to accept, the wretched of the world as if the U.S. is a passive, actor in all this, as if in this region they don't have a tremendous influence. So I would open it up from the perspective of sort of, from El Salvador to see how that sort of fits into that. So I'll leave my.
Thank you. We have one question over here and 2 questions over there.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking it's going to be answer the question, and then my question will go. But my name is Jasmine Moen. I am running for Virginia Senate. This is for the state. And it's been happening a lot with our community. I am half Palestinian and half Latina. And in every time that I have a debate or I have a questioning, the first thing is, what about MS-13? And I want to know your opinion because, for me, I embrace everyone. I'm not here for division. But every person that is not knowledge, even Gillespie, was putting a campaign, very strong campaign, about demonizing us all as part of MS-13. I know that people, because I used to practice immigration, and I know people, kids, who were forced to be part of MS-13 or their mother was going to be killed. That's how tough was in El Salvador. But I want to know your opinion because also there is at the Congress a very tough act that is going to pass in which they are planning to cut the migration chain. That's how they call it. Mm-hmm. And I want to know your opinion about that as well. And I thank you. And I know that we can together come up with a solution for all of us because after all, immigrants, we all are immigrants, right?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Baumann with CSIS Americas. We talked a lot about kind of our broken immigration system and how TPS is a patch for that. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts. If you all were able to influence the creation of a new immigration system, what kind of characteristics do you think that we should be prioritizing in immigrants? Should it be people with families here, people with work skills, or what it may be? And how should we as a country go about thinking about what kind of people we should be prioritizing?
Hi, I'm Audrey Volanovich from The Dialogue, and we're all pretty familiar with the rhetoric that's the political rhetoric of immigration and TPS here in America. But concerning the upcoming political candidacy in El Salvador, what are the platforms of the El Salvadorian candidates concerning TPS in these upcoming elections?
Okay, we'll make room for a 5th question.
Okay.
I'm Jack Martin, retired former U.S. diplomat with service in Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay. I'd take as a starting point the comment that TPS serves a purpose. I think that was true when it was created. Since we've discovered in the last more or less decade that we can exercise discretion as to who we deport, who we allow to stay here, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose anymore, and it made no sense that we created the current problem we're addressing by adopting a legal system that gave legal presence to people who entered the country illegally. I welcome any comments on this. I think the TPS ought to disappear now that we understand that we have other ways of dealing with the problem of people who are in the country at a time that civil strife or a natural disaster happens in their homeland.
Thank you. I don't know if, Andrew, you want to start first. Just as a brief point, I think TPS has a purpose, and even today has a purpose. The Central American outflow of migration right now is the second migration wave in the world after Syrian refugees. And they're coming to the US seeking some form of relief, temporary relief, as it may seem. But we have another crisis right in front of our faces, and that's Venezuelan out-migration that is now estimated to be nearly 3 million people, 1 million in Colombia alone. Last year, at least 25,000 Venezuelans applied for asylum here in the United States. The temporary protected status is an important element to this conversation. I don't think it's something that could be rid of as the current state of the world is. Sorry, my discretionary powers.
That's good. I agree with you. Let me say yes.
Thank you.
I mean, it's still useful, but yes. Let me go to actually your question from CSS, and then I'll come back to Abel's here. But we're spending a fair amount of time on legal immigration at MPI, actually, and it's something that we're passionate about, how we thinking about what our legal immigration system should look like. I don't have an opinion, but let me walk you through sort of where our thinking is and the decision points we have to make. I mean, right now we have a system that's overwhelmingly weighted. We had about 1.2 million legal entries last year into the U.S., legal immigrant entries. Very low unauthorized entries. I mean, I had people in this room, I know this, but not everyone in the U.S. does. We have very low unauthorized entries. Majority right now are visa overstayers, as near as we can tell, not border crossers. But the numbers, the unauthorized population has been steady for about 10 years right now. So there's few people coming in, a few people leaving every year. So you'd have to add to the 1.2 million, but not a whole lot there. It's not what we had 10 and 15 years ago. Before 2007, we really did have a lot of unauthorized entries. That just isn't happening anymore. Right now, 68% of people come in through family categories. That's a lot. That is by far and away the largest percentage in the industrialized world. About 12% come through employment categories, 13% through refugee categories. The last fiscal year, that number is going down because the cap has been cut. And diversity visa is about 4%. So that's the latest statistics that I have on this. I think the first question is, the family is high. In every immigration reform debate we've had, we've talked about shifting that balance a little more in the direction of employment. I would not disagree with that. I think the question is, how much do you shift it? Family immigration, we should not demonize it. When people talk about chain immigration, family immigration is actually part of what makes integration work. And two of my colleagues who work on integration are here. I mean, part of what makes integration work in a very laissez-faire immigration system, we don't do what Canada or Australia does and resettle people when they get here. We let people go into communities where they know someone, usually a family member, occasionally someone from their community. And integration has worked so well in this country, and it really does work well in this country, with stops and starts and problems, but overall has worked really well because family immigration is such a big part of it. So I don't think we want to get rid of that, but reasonable people could suggest that we want more employment-based, right? That we want to shift that balance to some degree, right? And we could figure out what that would look like. And then the question is, on employment, are we only talking about high-skilled? We love talking about high-skilled people, but where actually in the labor market are their needs? Because it turns out there are low-skilled and middle-skilled needs in the economy as well. So we need to have that conversation about what does the labor market look like? Where do we actually need people? As a matter of fact, just as a point of fact, just as a fun fact, about half the people that come in through the U.S. immigration system now have a college degree. About a third of native-born Americans have a college degree. Again, a third, 32% of US-born people have a college degree. 47 to 48% of immigrants have a college degree. We're already getting a very educated group of people coming in through the system we have, but that doesn't mean we don't want to be more intentional and actually match people with niches in the labor market where there's a need, because I think we probably do. But we need to figure out, it's not just computer programmers. It's people at very different skill levels. So that's a serious conversation. Diversity visa does not have a strong basis of support, except that it has been important in diversifying, particularly bringing people from Africa. But if you did more of a robust employment-based system, I think you'd actually get a lot of people from Africa. They're the most educated immigrants that come. And refugees is a huge point of contention, which I'm happy to talk about more, but clearly we have an administration that does not think we should be doing much on that, and others, probably majority of Americans disagree with that, but that is the White House's prerogative to set the cap. And then obviously there has to be a conversation about what happens to the unauthorized population, about 11 million people, most of whom have been here for two-thirds have been here for more than 10 years at this point. So this is a population, according to Pew, this is a population that has deep roots, as we've seen on TPS, but it's true also if you look at Mexicans. It's true if you look at other unauthorized populations, and we'd have to figure out what we do with enforcement. And there has to be, part of having a system with integrity is also figuring out how you enforce those mechanisms. So I would say that's a reasonable conversation that has to happen. On demographics, I'll just be very brief because Oscar, yes.
Interject
yes.
before you go to his question? Yeah. Related to your question, see, part of the problem, me and many other people argue, that the problem is when we pretend to have a conversation about U.S. immigration policy in isolation. Let me tell you what I mean. I've been in quite a few business, technology circles where to speak of a world without borders does not freak out anybody. You talk about the mobility of capital, the mobility of goods. I mean, if I were to ask all of you to take off every piece of garment you're wearing that was manufactured someplace else, we would be naked. So here is my point. Immigration policy cannot really be fully understood and resolved positively if we insist on having this isolated conversation about immigration. It has to be had in the context of the kind of world we, the United States of America, has been a leading nation in shaping where we are today. Human mobility is nothing but the natural evolution of how we have oriented trade, global finance, etc. Culture. You can go anywhere in the world today and watch essentially the same type of programming. So are we really to be surprised that there are so many people on the move nowadays? So I would argue very strongly that yes, we need to give some more deep thinking about where immigration should be, how it should look like, but the more we can actually conjugate, the debate, the conversation about immigration to the global economic reality of multi-dependency where we now live, I think we will be probably closer to finding a solution that makes sense. And I would only end that part in pointing that there is a lot to be said, a great debate to be had as to whether we support policies abroad that actually make countries like El Salvador places nobody wants to live from, okay? And that's not only in the economic arena, but the national security arena, the technology arena, the cultural arena. Frankly, I would prefer much more to be in El Salvador. And I was talking to a friend of mine on Sunday morning, and she was on the phone with me, and I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, we're heading to the beach for breakfast." Yeah. Meanwhile, I was shoveling snow in Chicago. So believe me, the attractions to come to this country are not as great as people like to think. It boils down to where can I sell my labor force in a way that I can provide better for my family. That's what it boils down to. If we can make that happen someplace else, believe me, we'll have a lot fewer people. Mexico, it's beautiful. Food a lot better than here.
And let me add to the same, let me add to the same, in the sense that for us, family reunification definitely is vital because that is the essence of society, is family. Questionable if it should go, for ascendants or descendants, all that. But there's another aspect I wanted to emphasize is the recognition of U.S. labor needs. And I just want to give the example of TPS. Our Salvadoran TPS holders, 20% of them work in construction. The average in the US population, only 4% work in construction. If you look at services, which again, I'm sure all of you have gone to a restaurant here in Washington and found a Salvadoran there to serve you, only 1% of the US population works in this type of services. 20% of Salvadorans with TPS work there. So there is a labor need that also has to be covered. Back to you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
By the way, I don't disagree with Oscar, although he and I have different, I think we come down in different practical ways of dealing with this, but I think you're right. Clearly, we want to look at our immigration policy in global terms. And by the way, I think it's phenomenal that you've come with a delegation of business leaders to do this. I was thinking about this as you were talking earlier. I think this makes, and I've said this to a couple of you, I mean, I think it makes a huge amount of difference that people in Congress and in the administration hear from business leaders and see that this is not just government is concerned about what's going on with TPS, but this is a commitment from the larger society and for the business community. But I think it's very helpful. The more that we can be educated in this country on how we fit into the rest of the world, that is incredibly helpful. And at the same time, and this goes to Abel's point, I think we're living through a moment in this country, and it's not just in this country, where there's a retrenchment into a sense of sovereignty, not because we're secure. It's a patriotism that is not driven by security, but because we're afraid. Okay, and I don't think this is a majority of Americans, but there is a sector of Americans, and yes, there is racism, no question about it, in certain sectors of American society, and there always has been, by the way. I spent some time reading treatises from 100 years ago about, the swarthy Italians and the Irish that will never become Americans, and you can go through any, the Germans, Benjamin Franklin you referenced. Benjamin Franklin's referred to the Germans as swarthy too, by the way. Those swarthy Germans. They're undemocratic and all this. This is in the 1700s. So there's a history of this, right? There is a history of this in this country. So it's not that does not exist, but I think we do have to take two other things seriously. And we have to take economics seriously, which is, I think, in an economy that is increasingly moving fast and where jobs are being created and recreated and destroyed much quicker than they ever have been. For many people, and particularly, and the less education you have, the more it is, but it's not only if you don't have education, the scarier world this is to live in, right? Globalization, to some of us, sounds like a great thing. When we talk about globalization, we think of the benefits of being able to try a different cuisine and to know people with different cultures and to, be part of a larger world. For many people, globalization is a symbol for their job possibly disappearing, right? For a factory that they know that closed where their friend worked. For the fact that their town, I spent some time, I talked about this last week, actually in the same room, in a town in Pennsylvania that was once one of the great towns in Pennsylvania, but it has declined for the past 60 or 70 years. And this sense of loss of people there. And for them, globalization, and it's trade, it's immigration, it's automation, it's all of that, is a bad word, right? And part of what they see in this moment, immigrants get lumped into a set of things. And yes, some of it is racism. I mean, some of it's out and out sort of racism, but some of it is also fear and loss. Some of it is fear and loss tied to really tangible fear of losing their job, not being able to compete in the economy that's coming. And I think we need to take those emotions seriously. As much as we want to demonize those that demonize others, we also need to understand that some of those things bubbling up there, are tied to fear and loss, and need to recognize those in people as well. And immigrants get thrown into that, right? And in this particular town, immigrants have been particularly successful. And so, and actually, it turns out native-born whites are not that unsuccessful in the town. I mean, they're kind of where they were before. They're actually probably doing slightly better than they were before. But relative, they see other people coming in and doing incredibly well and starting businesses, and sort of the sense is, why them and not me? And yes, you could call it racism, and there probably is a piece of racism in it, but there's also a sense of loss in there, and a sense of, I'm not getting ahead. If they were getting ahead, there might still be some racism there, but it would be a different conversation we'd be having. There are some real things that are making people scared and making this debate uglier than it might be otherwise.
Abel, to continue on your question of the shared responsibility, let me give you an example, which is drug trafficking. For us in Central America, where it is truly a passageway from countries further south that produce the drug, moving towards the market where they are well paid, which means coming up to the US, to Canada, Europe. The toll that we have from organized crime that then corrupts our judicial system, our police, our customs houses. It is truly a co-responsibility between the consumers, if you want, and us stuck in the middle like a sandwich. I shared last night, for example, what's the toll and the pressure then on countries like us? You have to stop drug trafficking. We don't produce it. And how are we going then to stop? So U.S. supports us in many programs, but it's not enough when the price for the drug dealers and the organized crime is so big, and the resources that they have, it's impressive. I'll just put it up. This is a map of non-commercial maritime routes, but shipments, you could say, tracked during all the year 2016. And you can see my little El Salvador, as you say, very, very small, el pulgarcito de Centroamérica. It's almost blank. It's almost blank if you look at if you look at the frequencies from Colombia to Guatemala, quite different. Why? Because in El Salvador, we were able to sign with the United States a monitoring center that is based out of our airport, from which we strive and control much better our territory, and especially we recognize as territorial grounds 200 nautical miles, and that has given us a safeguard. So that's a type of shared responsibility where you are completely right. There are actions from the U.S. that affect us that are not native to us, where we have to work together.
While we are at that, and I really want to come back to Abel's question, but let's just for a second, and this is a conversation for another gathering. Drug trafficking, how much money have we spent? How much of your money and my money have we spent trying to curtail illicit narcotics from getting into the U.S.? I mean, we're talking about an unbelievable amount of money over the last 50 years. And are there more illicit drugs in the U.S. today than 40 years ago? Bet that that's the case. So I would even argue, whether we are chasing the wrong goose, when it comes to how do we keep talking and doing so-called drug policy, in the U.S. But again, that's for another day, another conversation. It is a fact, if you review rates of fertility in the U.S., that people of Asian, Latin American, and Afro descendants in the U.S. have higher birth rates than white European descendants. That's a fact. And we could close every single port of entry tomorrow, and it will not change the natural evolution of where are we going to be 10, 20, 50 years from now in terms of the makeup. And I have to say, there are some people in the very fringes, frankly, but sadly now some of them in the White House, who fear that, okay? They don't like the notion that we may well become a country where the majority of people aren't white European descendants. That's a fact too. Now, what I want to go back to is some of the questions that were made regarding MS-13. Andrew pointed to a reality. We are a society of people living in fear. And the degree of fear changes, okay? We are fearful, about our national security in a so-called anti-terrorist mode, if you want. And there are reasons, for us to be fearful about. We are fearful about the fact that my children may not do better than I did, economically speaking. You may recall that 2 years ago, for the first time ever, most Americans said that they do not believe that their children will do better. So economically, there are plenty of reasons to be fearful. The examples you mentioned are some of them. But I also believe that people are fearful that neither Republicans or Democrats are capable of solving problems. People have lost faith in our very political system. That's why Congress, as 2 years ago, was less popular than roaches. And I'm not kidding. And it is because people fear, that they are unable to solve problems, the problems that people endure on a daily basis. So MS-13 is actually one useful tool, when it comes to fostering fear. If you actually take the time to review criminality in the US, as recorded, as monitored by our very Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, you will find that any mentioning of MS-13 is pure political manipulation. I was surprised, for example, that President Trump did not talk about what happened in Las Vegas. Not long ago, 53 people were killed in a single afternoon. Did he talk about that? No, because that's not useful for his narrative. MS-13 is. It's much better, much more convenient because it kind of put more wood to the fire. So rest assured that there have been crimes committed by people who are indeed foreign nationals that are horrible, that are absolutely to be held accountable. People should pay, for the infractions they commit the way the law mandates. But let me remind you of one other case that at the moment was very popular and President Trump used it in his campaign. You may recall that young white woman that was killed by a single gunshot in San Francisco. The guy who was just put to trial was actually found innocent of the actual killing of that woman. How many of you heard that? Probably not very many, because it's not exciting anymore to report what the facts actually showed. The damage was already done. The image that was elevated was the image that every single Mexican is a rapist, a killer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what the data actually tell us. And there is more I'd like to say. The whole chain migration is absolutely, again, a manufactured thing. Last time I checked, we are supposed to be the nation that care about family values. One positive thing about George W. Bush, he said family values do not end, at the Rio Grande. And people may not remember, but that's George W. Bush saying so. I like to believe that we still care about family. And that's why family ties remain important as a piece of our immigration policy. The last thing I want to comment has to do with the question that was asked somewhere here about how do people in El Salvador, political parties in El Salvador, the government of El Salvador view, TPS. Let me take that one additional step. We are among a few, literally a handful of nations in the world with at least 20% of the population no longer residing in that tiny little territory called El Salvador. I was recently, about 2 weeks ago in El Salvador, just listening to a debate about the next 25 years organized by El Faro, as a matter of fact. There was not a single mentioning of Salvadorians abroad when they were talking about the next 25 years in our country. To me, that's a shame. And one of the things that we do in my organization is try, and we're going to do it luckily with more strength the next 3 years, thanks to some support that we've been able to secure, to actually try to work with the business elite, with the political elite of all parties, to try to make them understand what does it mean to have to govern a nation that is no longer just about the people in that little territory called El Salvador. Because we should be talking about that conversation much more heavily, than we have so far. And so forget about TPS alone. Every now and then you see people from all political parties talking about this, but we need to do a lot more. And we need to change the way we think about who we are and who we have become as a result of migration.
And if I may just add, in agreeing with what you have also expressed, I might say that many times the way that you see a political candidate is very much in a utilitarian type of way of looking at TPS. First from the recipients of the remittances. That's one way. The other way is because I was blessed with the opportunity to co-author a book way back in 2004, more or less, asking for the vote for Salvadorans abroad. And this was done with Dr. Varela, that we did it together. And we showed, the imminence and importance of incorporating all Salvadorans in the future of the country. Vote is now possible. Our Salvadorans can register and can vote in our different consulates and embassies. But there's still one more step that we have not gotten. And we showed more than 70 examples around the world, and I will only mention Switzerland, which was one of them, is that because Switzerland also has an enormous population of Swiss living outside. So in Congress, in Switzerland, there is an assigned number of seats in Congress that belong to the Swiss abroad. And they don't have to belong to a party. You know, it's simply that. When I was minister, unfortunately, I have to tell this story because it's an example, because there was no influence from the Salvadorans outside. The Minister of Interior he just ordered, the manufacturing of our passports, and he forgot that half of those passports are really, obtained outside of El Salvador. So the security measures and everything that had, to do with our foreign ministry being able to deliver identity cards to Salvadorans, that was simply not in his head. It was not in his radar. And that's why we need, and it's part of my message in that book was, not only it's the vote, it's also the representation. But I believe that more and more, the politicians are understanding that they have to listen to this. But also we want Salvadorans outside to understand that the peril that Salvadorans who remain in El Salvador is much worse, and it's much more difficult than simply someone who has health care taken care of, education taken care of, security taken care of, and kind of simply indicate or mandate what has to be done. Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. So sorry.
Thank you. We have a few minutes to get some additional set of questions. I think there are 2 or 3 issues here that are being put forward, and they're somewhat tough. The one is that last night one of the members of Congress said, when it comes to immigration debates, it's more about opinions than facts. Facts don't matter very much. I mean, we can prove you statistically in many ways the significance of the economic contribution of migrants. Just factoids abound. 4% of the labor force in the United States works in construction. In the context of a 4% unemployment rate in this country, when you look at the composition of that 4% of the labor force, nearly half of that is made of foreign-born immigrants. And a large chunk of them include people on TPS, those 200,000 plus Salvadorans, 25% of them work in construction. The second issue is, you're challenged that is a matter of opinion rather than facts. Second, it's informed by the fear of change. Set aside, whether you have an activist bias, a racist bias, a demographic bias. This is a debate that I remember dealing with 20, 30 years ago in college. But if the fear of change is there, then the logical question is, well, what are the confidence-building mechanisms we need to look at to convince people, that immigration is not that much of a threat outside of the facts? And then the third is, we're dealing with what another staff member of Congress and Peter Hakim say. We're dealing with an administration that is transactional. So, what do you are prepared to transact here? Or is there room for transaction, or do you have to do anything? Within the context of TPS, I think ending these 3 issues really matter. So let me open 3 more questions for you as we discuss the topic. There is one person here, one person there.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the panel and the discussion so far. My name's John Myers. I'm with Swiss Contact, which is a Swiss NGO working in Salvador. And we have $1 million project we just launched to do certification of returning migrants. And it's not just targeted to TPS, but more, the 50,000 or so that have been returning annually for the past couple of years. So I just wanted to know about the data on labor because as people are being certified through this program, where are the needs in construction, in tourism, in food services? That would be helpful if there's more data.
Question here.
My name is Justin Margolis, Government of Quebec, and my question is with regard to third countries, because as it was the case with Haitians, there was a wave of Haitians that came to Canada. There was a more natural link between a Haitian diaspora in French-speaking Quebec. Now their cases are being adjudicated under Canadian law. Do you think that there is a potential that Salvadorians are looking to third countries, be it Canada or otherwise, considering diaspora links?
Thank you. One last question over here.
Thank you. Eric Fajardo from MRS, Migration and Refugee Services. Well, the panel put a question over the table. What consequences will have the TPS cancellation for the United States? We've been talking about what consequence it will have for El Salvador and Salvadorians, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit more about what consequence it will have here in the United States, given that this is a paradox. The TPS is just one extreme of a chain with two links. The other extreme of the chain is the CAM or CAM minors. These Salvadorians going to be deported? Probably yes. And probably we can talk about reunification back in El Salvador. How about probably the same amount of immigrants coming with legal status as refugees here, many of them already permanent residents at this point, and probably potential citizens, US citizens in a while. So are we really closing the chapter for the TPS holders? Because these kids gonna be citizens and they're gonna have the right to claim their parents eventually. So how about that? What can you say about this aspect of the problem?
Thank you. Should we go?
Sure, Justin, Canada. I think yes. I don't think we know the answer yet. We've seen it with Haitians coming across. I would be surprised. There's a large number of people. There's a large Salvadoran community, particularly in Montreal, if I remember correctly, and also out west in Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Thank you, in Manitoba. So I would be surprised. I'm not sure it's going to be a wave, but I would be surprised if there isn't some movement that direction. And you open up the opportunity for me to comment on one other thing, which is, part of why the crisis, we were with some of your colleagues from both Quebec and from the Canadian government not long ago talking about this. And, the number of people that came from the US and crossed into Canada was never large by our standards. I mean, we're talking thousands of people a month, which, is fairly small. But for Canada, it was a crisis. And it was a crisis because it tested the integrity of the system. And for Canadians, part of the bargain has been Canada has, on any standard, any polling you see has probably the highest, of major immigrant countries, has the highest approval of immigrants that you can find. But part of the bargain, and by the way, U.S. is not that far behind. I do want to stress this. I mean, as much as there are some really ugly elements and some real unease in parts of the American public, and even people who are pro-immigrant, if you scratch the surface, also have concerns about immigration, right? It's not a slam dunk that 2/3 of Americans are, thrilled about immigration. But overall, you have 2/3 of Americans that are fairly positive about immigration. We're a little below Canadians, but not that far. But part of what's worked in Canada is the sense of system integrity, which is something we don't have in this country, right? Which is that the sense that lots of people come in, a lot more than the US compared to the population. Canada has more foreign-born people than we do. But at the same time, and you have some cities where, like Toronto, which is about half foreign-born at the moment, right? I mean, Greater Toronto. But the bargain is that people come in through legally established systems, right? And those are maintained. And so when that started to break, that created the crisis. This is where we need to end up at some point, which is to your question. At some point we need to end up with a system. We clearly don't have a system that can be enforced the way it exists, but we do need to end up with a system that makes rational sense and does get enforced and has integrity. And there is a deal that can be made around that at some point, though I have severe doubts that that deal is going to be made anytime soon, despite what we're seeing going on in the Senate, or perhaps because of what we're seeing going on in the Senate. So I'll stop there and let others answer the other questions.
I don't really have an answer to any of the last questions, except maybe yours. But I do want to come back to something you said, Manuel. And to me, it's more, what's the solution? What are we to do, about this specific issue? I think above and beyond the fact that we will keep trying, to make a miracle come true, not by, expecting that the Congress will consider on a standalone basis any of the proposals that are already filed in the US Congress, but by essentially doing what historically has been done. I mean, immigration policy was hardly ever the subject of debate as a standalone matter. It was usually at the last minute stuck, into something else that had to pass, and that's how some changes have actually taken place. So we believe that there are opportunities, but above and beyond that, and above and beyond the fact that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of the legal defense options, that people should be able to explore so that they can stay, with their families, and as I said, paying their mortgages, etc. I believe that the long-term solution that we need to begin tomorrow, because long-term, sometimes people say, oh, what do I care about the long-term? I'll be dead. But the real issue is, what do we begin to do today? And to me, the task ahead is, how can we create, how do we work towards more opportunities for meaningful interaction, conversation between people who would themselves say, I'm not a racist, but are fearful of immigrants, and create opportunities for more meaningful conversation so that they can discover that the people they may well fear and reject are frankly not so different than they are. And to me, that is a task that is hard because it's not exciting. I tell you for sure, it's not going to be DC the most important place to have that conversation. I think that conversation needs to be had outside Washington, D.C. But to me, that is important. And I relate this to the question of what is the consequence, for the U.S. if TPS were to be indeed brought to an end. Let's also keep in mind that the immigration question keeps being a moving target. There are people in the U.S. who, for example, want to end family migration altogether. And I think it's important not to discard the fact that because of all the fear factors that we've been talking about, there are people who may well be confused and may think that ending family migration altogether is a good thing. And the last thing I will say is, I think that there are indeed countries around the world that in the past have actually handled the influx of foreign-born population better than we have from an integration point of view, I would even argue. But what it is new, and as someone who has been involved at the UN level with the Global Compact on Migration and Refugees, I'm increasingly concerned that from a political standpoint, attacking foreigners has become politically popular. And even in countries that have had a history of relatively positive responses to foreign nationals, are all of a sudden sliding into this idea that if I attack foreigners, I will get more votes. And that's a very dangerous trend that we all should be working together to figure out how do we reverse.
Thank you so very much. And again, thank you. We are quite aware of Swiss Contact and other nations, support. And may I first say that as a country, we have made enormous strides in the basis of education. We have moved from, before it was only primary education that was obligatory, now we've made it all the way to secondary school. But still there, the average schooling for our children is about 9 years still. The difficult part is in the rural areas where you can go down up to 5 years. So what you're doing in training, especially in technical training, is an excellent complement to our still, fragile education system that needs to be complemented and completed. Secondly is the alliance between public and private. Jobs are generated by the private sector. You cannot have a sustainable country where you think that the government is going to be creating jobs for everyone. It's not the way it really should work for sustainability. So we see the potential through, for example, Partnership for Growth, which is an alliance that the U.S. has towards the Northern Triangle, where by imposing 16 conditions that go from transparency to impunity to justice and commissions on education and health and so, are pushing all national efforts to create the basis where we can then generate together, in public and private alliances. Public through in coordinating and establishing the investment opportunities in climate, especially in investment climate, to be able to then produce the jobs that all of these kids not only need, but demand, and they have a right for that. Secondly, I would like to go to Eric in the impact that you were asking. We have 60,000 Salvadoran dreamers, and we're very proud of them. We had lunch yesterday with a person who came into this country again, brought by his parents, completely undocumented until he graduated from law school. He was undocumented from primary, secondary. He did his bachelor's and then graduated from law school undocumented. Finally, he was able to go through a U visa and is now legal, and he's a leader in the Salvadoran community. So the contributions that these type of peoples do, and if we only take TPS, you're talking that they are, every single year, they're pitching into Social Security and Medicare more than $481 million right now, as of now. And if you count their contribution in the economy, you can put that at $3.1 billion annually of contribution to the GDP. And the significance that they have in several communities where the concentration is even more, California, Texas, Long Island, and New York. So the impact would definitely be quite sensitive when you feel, the absence, especially of that small business. We're not talking about large, small businesses. So thank you again, Manuel, for your patience with us.
No, thank you very much. I think, we need to find silver linings on any discussions regarding policy debates, not only on immigration. As the Senate is debating this subject, it's important to see where TPS is fitting, if at all, in this context. There are three major groupings or three alignments in the Senate right now. A conservative group that is basically promoting the 4-point plus President Trump's agenda on immigration reform. There is a second group, which is a relatively powerful group. There is a second group that is a moderate, compromising group that is trying to offer a compromise within the 4 points, but again, it's still within the 4 points. Compromise, including the diversity visa, which could lead to some visas for those on TPS. And then there is a third group, the more moderate, that is trying to rescue the original transactional component, which was, DACA in exchange of a wall. That's the context that we are at right now, and it's the context that the House will also is debating this issue. So the challenge within the context of a debate on TPS is really how to make louder the noise about thinking of legalizing those under TPS as a logical as well as a politically and morally defensible step. And one has to be creative on finding those noises. The transactional side of it is, what can you offer to provide more confidence that the threat of immigration or the fear of immigration is not a real threat? With that, I wish you happy Valentine's. And thank you very much for attending, and thank you to our guests.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you to the delegation.